Hi, everyone. This is Craig Zelzer from PCDN with Ilana Milkes Espinosa. We're here for Season 10, Episode 4. Happy Episode 4 with Ilana. I'm based in Medellin, Colombia. She's currently in Bogota, but will be traveling soon. We're going to be talking about shaking things up for impact, which we need a lot more of that in the world. A career at the intersection of startups, social impact, and sustainability. Ilana is a serial innovator and impact maker and shaker. She's founded 2 startups. One is World Tech Makers, and the second, more recent one is ePioneers. World Tech Makers is still going strong. She can tell you about it. Both startups focus on supporting innovations at the center of the fourth industrial revolution, economic opportunity, and sustainability. She's been working in the social impact sector for almost a decade and also was a member of the Colombian women's national football team. So hopefully we can integrate that in. There is a lot of work being done in sport for social impact. She is also a global shaper for the World Economic Forum, a One Young World Ambassador, a Latitude Fellow, an Ambassador for Marca País Colombia, for 100.org, and an MIT Innovator Under 35, and also was a student entrepreneur in residence at Draper University. She holds an MBA from Roosevelt University and speaks several languages, including Spanish, English, Portuguese, and French. For people who may not have been in a live stream PCDN podcast before, I will ask questions, and at any time we'd love to bring in your questions and comments. So before we get started, while you're watching on LinkedIn, feel free now or throughout the podcast is to let us know where you're watching from. And if you want to share a sentence or two about your background or interests. And then once you're about 10 or 15 minutes in, feel free to also ask questions, share comments, because we like to make this as interactive as possible. Just 2 quick plugs. We have about over 100 other episodes with brilliant innovators from over 25 countries, from fintech to reducing gender-based violence, to engineering for change, to impact investing, to working on humanitarian relief. So if you are open, check the episodes out. And we especially appreciate if you take 30 seconds to rate the podcast on your favorite platform, whether it's Apple, Google, Podcast Addict, and/or share in your networks. So again, please feel free to let us know where you're watching from, put that in any time. And so Ilana, thank you so much for making time out of your busy schedule to join us. And to start off with, can you talk a little bit about throughout your professional career, what type of impact have you been focused on achieving or fostering?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. In terms of focus and impact, so I first started, going back to kind of like my first job in impact was this NGO by Ted Gonder, who also became like a well-known like social impact entrepreneur. And this was like an NGO to teach, finance basics to children in Chicago. And then I decided to launch my own startup in EdTech because I believe education can have a huge impact, and in particular, types of training that enable, new skills for new jobs like tech-based and with new methodologies. And so since the end of 2014, we pioneered coding bootcamps in Latin America, partnering with the international sector like the World Bank, NGOs like Fundación EPM, the public sector like the mayorship of Medellin, and then, education funds like Sumati were born out of those results from coding bootcamps that we pioneer in the region. And then since 2019, I started to think about how to do 2 things. So 1, decentralized living, and then 2, decentralized impact investing, because I had this experience of going to the Caribbean and seeing coral bleaching happening in the north shores of the country, and not much happening around, ecosystems development, around climate finance, and also digital nomads. And so I led the creation of Colombia's Digital Nomads Visa that was just approved a few months ago with World Tech. It was a huge milestone, I think, for everyone. And then also I started to work on climate finance, leveraging blockchain technologies and new types of ways to digitize ecosystem services. So now it's kind of an intersection of decentralized living and decentralized climate investing.
Wonderful. So just to put in a plug, we had Monica Perez, who's a friend, used to be the head of the APM Foundation. She was on our podcast a couple of weeks ago. Her episode will be sharing. It's already on our platform, but now she works for the Nature Conservancy, but she worked for EPM Foundation, so it's a nice intersection there. So one question, just to focus. There's so many things to talk about, and please feel free to start putting your questions and comments. So were you born a techie, or in terms of your actual technical, like I was talking to a developer today from South Asia who's like a techie who works for social impact. So did you develop your tech skills and then go into social impact? You went to social impact and develop your tech skills? And like, what is your advice for people who want to work at this intersection? Like, where do they concentrate on upskilling?
Yeah, so I actually started first with tech skills. So I took a coding bootcamp in Ruby on Rails development in Chicago, like a 4-month program. And this was like the beginning for me in the start of the tech industry. I like designing more than developing, in full honesty. So I became a self-taught software designer. So I'm more on the UX, UI side of software design, more than development. But in my case, it was this coding bootcamp experience that totally shaped my perspective on what these types of education programs could do. And then I became a technology, social impact entrepreneur. So it was first the coding bootcamp experience, and then launching the Coding Academy, and then becoming a software designer.
And so for people who are thinking about a career, let's say at this intersection, because there's many ways you can go, let's say for people who don't speak tech, what are your recommendations for how to start developing enough tech skills to either be able to work with tech people, or if they want to go fully into tech, where do you start? Because there's so many opportunities and things are adapting so fast. Like if someone just wants to know enough to get started, where do you recommend they start in terms of upskilling?
Yeah, I think one of the big mindset breakthroughs for me is realizing that you don't have to have a computer science degree to become a technical person, whether this is development or design or data science or any other type of tech job. So one is understanding that the new models and the new types of jobs in the future and now are changing at a pace where we know the trends of most of the jobs by 2030 will be freelancer based in the US, for instance. Most will be tech based. At least 70% will have a tech component. So I think the first step is like a mindset of, okay, I can do it. I don't have to be an engineer to get into tech. Now, that's the first part. If you want to start looking at where to find, kind of coding bootcamp, there's a huge resource. I believe the name is, you can Google coding bootcamps ranking. I forgot the name of the portal, but you can see a ranking of global bootcamps offered all over the world. This didn't exist when we started. And so this is also a good starting point because you can see data by region, by salary type, by tech type, by application. And then there's also Holo IQ, which is like a research company that maps different ecosystems, and there's the EdTech ecosystem mapped out. So Holo IQ, I believe it's .com. And if you want to start and get going with skills, Code Academy is a good starting point. You can do some tutorials. Also, look at the communities on Stack Overflow. Nowadays, there are different types of languages that you can Google, understand the different types of applications, and there are online programs that you can start connecting with. And in general, tech people are very open. So if you message them, they'll get back to you and kind of like give you some time to understand if you have questions. So I think it's more about being proactive and knowing that you don't have to have a degree in engineering or computer science to become a tech person. So these will be kind of my recommendation.
Okay, thank you so much. So welcome Sade from Sweden, Ethiopia, Emma from the UK. I just put in there Catalina and I would do small scale angel investing. So one tech kind of bootcamp company we've invested in is called Henry, really focused on Latin America. But there's hundreds all over, and some are really good. Some you have to look at their metrics and always look carefully at their pricing. If they charge upfront, once you have a placement, where do they place jobs? And reviews, because most are quite good, but there's some that charge a lot of money that don't do much in terms of upskilling your careers. So how in the world did you go from, if you think back to a younger age, I mean, when you were thinking about professions or the areas you wanted to work in, did you have aspirations when you were, let's say, a teenager to be, because you went into football, to be a professional football player or to work in impact, or to, like, can you explain a little bit how in the world, you went from X to winding up at a coding bootcamp to launching 2 startups to working really at the cutting edge of technology and sustainability?
I did want to become a professional soccer player, and I played for the national team, but I quit the national team actually, so that's another story. But I quit the team and I moved to the States to play for the university and became a student athlete there. So this was kind of the end of my ambition to become a professional soccer player. But when I was a teenager, I did think about it. Then I got into finance. So I started working in a private equity firm in New York City. And I was there for almost a year, so 8 months, did an internship, learn about private equity and the different types of finance, kind of like, I'll say verticals. And then I joined a hedge fund. I also joined FX Street, which is derivatives trading for, I was covering the Asian market. So everything related to futures, in particular, pairs of currencies. So covering US dollar versus yen, for instance, or other types of currencies. I then did a few months. Most of these jobs were like for a few months. It's kind of like more like exploring. And then I came across this coding academy and I learned to code, and this was kind of the beginning of that aspect. Now, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to study. In fact, when I did university, I did 2 careers, so history and finance, and then I did an MBA. But my first year, since this was liberal arts, I was actually preparing to be an anthropologist because I wanted to be an archaeologist, and I imagined myself going to Africa and like, digging, these kind of like ancient, kind of like sites. And then I realized that within anthropology, the periods of time of humans weren't right. So there's actually a huge mystery of the evolution of human beings. And so I was like, yeah, well, maybe this is not what I want. And so I was like very confused. And I did international relationships as my major. And then I went to history and finance. So my first 2 years in college were just kind of understanding the different careers. It wasn't like I came with like clarity of, oh, I want to be this or do that. So I think, yeah, this was the process for me. And how did it happen? I think I like to solve problems. So in particular with the coding bootcamps, at the moment, there were no coding bootcamps in Latin America. So we were actually the pioneers. And to me, it just made sense because there's a lot of inequality. Jobs in IT were, are a trend. And we had the metrics of, employment rate, also increase of your salary, gender ratios too. And we did the first cohort, and then the World Bank approached us and they were doing the first study of coding bootcamps in emerging markets. And we were actually the selected bootcamp in 2015. And we ended up opening up the methodology. So companies like Henry came actually many years after, which I celebrate, but I want to be very clear on that. Yeah, I saw the evolution of the ecosystem in terms of groups of technologists and, funds being dedicated to this. And the coding bootcamp industry itself grew from nothing to, many coding bootcamps around the world now as a way to kind of close those gaps in terms of lack of IT professionals and both upskilling and reskilling. So I think these new models are solving the problem of unemployment, but at the same time, inequality, and at the same time, a deficit of programmers or tech people on behalf of companies. And then the same with the digital nomad visa. So I lived in a few countries. So after running the boot camps with the World Bank from Medellin, this was a very challenging year. And I ended up moving to Mexico, actually with the Tec de Monterrey, the university. They invited us to launch there. It was a bit unlucky because this was also the semester where the earthquake hit. So this was 2017. So we did launch a cohort, but then we were doing it during, after September 19, which was when the earthquake hit. And so it was a very challenging also semester, but we did it. And then I moved to Spain. And before that, I also was in Chile for the Startup Chile program in 2015. So I was also kind of a digital nomad, and I understood the challenges of digital nomads. And so when I came back to Colombia at the end of 2019, after living in Spain for almost 2 years, I realized that I could enable climate expedition and ecotourism while also regulating digital nomad visas in Colombia. And so I was very passionate about solving this problem and trying to find a solution. And so I kind of took the challenge of let's solve this. And now there's a process of educating and creating awareness about digital nomadism in the country and what this means for both internationals as well as locals. But also I'm very passionate now more on the climate finance infrastructure challenge. And so more than like industry, it's more like, oh, I see a problem that I become very passionate about and I do my best to solve. But it's not like a linear evolution. It's more like, I'll say like random.
Yes.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to figure out like what, is it a spiral? Is it a circle? Is it, in terms of a Venn diagram? Because it is, I think that's often the most interesting careers, in terms of not necessarily having a master plan, but going where the serendipity takes us and also where the opportunities are. So please check out World Pioneers and ePioneers and World Tech Maker. We'll get into more of those. So Emma has a question from the UK. What kinds of opportunities have you found most useful for you in your career path? So anything you've been talking about that, or anything you want to recommend for others who, let's say, are either new in the impact space or even mid-career and trying to pivot?
I think, Emma, thank you for your question. I think it's been a combination of what you're passionate about, the skills you can bring, and then the problems you can solve. So in my case, it's been like, what opportunity can I create for the ecosystem and for myself? For instance, coding boot camps and then opening up the methodology with international partners to move these forward. Same with the digital nomad visa, same with the climate finance infrastructure. We are aiming to kind of get to the next level. So it's been a combination of values, skills, and also the challenge. So I think this will be kind of the mix. But then the opportunities from the problems that you identify or you're passionate about solving.
So there's so many challenges and opportunities in the world. So let's say someone comes to you and said, you've already had a successful career and have hopefully many decades ahead of helping make the world and Colombia and lots of places improved in terms of sustainability and justice and equity. If someone's like, the world is such a mess and I don't want to be doing more X, I don't want to be building widgets. I want to figure out where someone's skills fit to the job market, but they're not sure whether it's environment or youth or education or health or the intersection. What advice do you give to people when they're like, they want to do impact work, but they're not sure how to start?
Yeah, I think every job has dignity, and every hobby or career has a lot of dignity. So I don't want to kind of point out the best or the worst, because I think it depends on the person's preferences. But in my case, climate to me is one of the biggest challenges we have, and I think people haven't realized the magnitude of this yet. And so some ecosystems are more advanced in terms of climate entrepreneurship, climate funding, climate issues in general. But I think there are a lot of very bright, talented people who are not necessarily thinking about solving these social issues or challenges, but thinking about other aspects, which is okay. But I think if we have this global challenge, I think this will be a good starting point. But again, this comes down also to your personality and how you want to kind of appreciate yourself. And you can be an artist and think only about writing songs or creating music, and that's great, and that's how you love yourself and you're expressing your talents and yourself through that. And so I think that also has massive value to societies. Or you can be an entrepreneur and be like, what challenge can I solve? But I don't think there's a better or worse profession or job in that sense. It depends on the person.
Okay. So 2 questions about entrepreneurship, then we'll move into digital nomad visas. So I was talking to a founder today, someone from Bogota. I won't go into anything too personal, but there's the vision, and they're successful, been around 10 years, have a company, but there's the vision of the impact they want to have versus what the market is willing to pay for. And we had a really interesting discussion, which I faced many times, is that the need around sustainability is so great, but often trying to sell sustainability to the market, it really has to come to the economic perspective, even though there's the moral case. And how do you balance in your startups or your own life that need, because we all need to make a living unless we have like someone else paying for it. So how have you balanced in World Tech Makers and ePioneers that need to like maximum social impact, help people get upskilling, get jobs, help address environmental challenges, but also the need to sustain operations? And have you found any tensions there, or your recommendations for others how to deal with like sustainability of your own enterprise and lifestyle and making the impact?
Yeah, I have to kind of agree with the person you mentioned. And actually, when I started as an entrepreneur in 2015, there was no ecosystem like there is now. There are no unicorn companies in Colombia. It was very kind of early. And so actually what ended up happening was that we received more support from outside than inside. Actually, we got into MIT's Mass Challenge program. We were like top 10 finalists. We also got investment from Tim Draper's team. Before even people understanding coding bootcamps, although we ran the first cohort by ourselves in Bogota first, and then it was the World Bank that sponsored the coding bootcamps. And then after a couple of years of having the results and methodologies published, the public sector in Medellin launched the fund, but this took years. And so in my case, I like to work at the intersection of pioneering new models, or I'll say almost perhaps new markets or new economies. And so in my case, when I kind of think about a problem, and this is also a personal preference, I like to think about new to foster or promote. And so we're not looking at market growth, but actually creating a new market. So for instance, coding bootcamps, they didn't exist. We knew what it meant to open up the methodology, but we didn't think this will kind of like be of detriment in the long term, because this was of benefit to the entire ecosystem, to the point where we saw coding bootcamps being launched from Medellin even. And so I think this was more of like a long-term perspective of ecosystem building. And the same with digital nomad visas. This was just out a few months ago, but it took us 3 years of funding ourselves, bringing the lawyers and funding the lawyers ourselves, having our team and bringing very high quality people to support these efforts. And I think in the next years, we'll see a boom of digital nomads, of services from local companies, and products being created only for digital nomads, and a shift perhaps in 5-10 years of a before and after the visa. And the same with climate finance, with blockchain. I think this is just getting started, but I think this will be a game changer as well. So in my case, it is a challenge. I'll recommend for you to connect perhaps with international networks or ecosystems that have more visionary approaches to impact and social entrepreneurship, and of course innovation, because I think you can be a social entrepreneur and also an innovator, and not necessarily rely on the ecosystem for making things work, because otherwise you can get stuck, or actually your probability of getting stuck is very high. So I'll suggest
so thank
for
you
you
so
to
much.
go beyond. Yeah.
So thank you so much. So lots of people have come in. Highness Mure from Uganda, Lorraine from Botswana, Celia from Seattle, Global Press. I love Global Press. Say hi to Lakshmi. So if people don't know, Global Press does incredible work of training women journalists around the world to do original reporting on their own context, and they syndicate it to national, international outlets. They do incredible work. And then Emma just says, thank you for your comment. So please feel free to have the questions come in. Feel free to add them. I'm surprised we don't have more people from Latin America, but that's totally okay. So just a follow-up question. This is much more as a founder perspective, or as an investor. I've had this from both sides. Like, we do small scale angel investing, and I've co-founded multiple nonprofits, and a social enterprise. So I know, and I've seen the challenges of raising money, whether it's from a foundation, individual donors, governments, vice versa. But specifically around for-profit or social enterprises, we used to work out of and also when you're talking about networks, I do want to put in a huge plug. So the ecosystem of change compared to 30 years ago, I'm older than you are, is just so much more vast. And now you can often find a network or a professional organization or a conference or a LinkedIn group around the areas that you're passionate about that do convening and sharing. And there's still way too much money spent in war and destroying the planet and fossil fuels, but there is more and more money and support, technical support, going towards founders, social enterprises from all over the world. Like, I participate in Asti Angels. It's trying to get more funding to female founders. There's Impact Hub, there's Skull. So don't do this by yourself. Find the right network or net. So just a question, because Kat and I used to work out of a wonderful space called 1776 in DC. One of the most, it no longer exists there. But, it was beautiful. We had like workshops and, treadmill desk and industrial kitchen. But everyone there on the founder end tended to be obsessed with scaling. But what scaling often meant is getting acquired or raising investment. And PCDN, we might not be the best business people. Like, our impact grows, our revenue stays about the same. And we used to say, like, isn't it okay, to just be a slow up or, to have impact as long as you can survive? And so from your own perspective, because I talk to a lot of founders, and sometimes I say, like, if you can bootstrap or grow a grant, sometimes investment is not the right option. Sometimes it is outside investment. So as a founder, what is your thought process around investment? If it's a for-profit enterprise, and if someone comes to you and say, I've got this great idea and I'm looking for investors, like, do you ever tell people don't invest, or like just thinking about how do you raise money beyond just your own operations, services, or sales?
Yeah, I think in impact, you have to look at the KPIs. So, for instance, how can you quantify changing someone's life? Because now they have a job in IT and they can feed their families, and then they have a career projection of 30 years, right? Versus before doing, a job that wasn't even kind of possibility for the future, for the long term. So I think you need to think about the KPIs you're measuring. As a founder, I personally like growth. I won't lie. I partner up with Team Draper, who has built and supported many unicorn companies. And with the climate finance startup, I do want to build a huge company. But I think that you're not looking at startup building from, kind of revenues perspective only. You're looking at different types of metrics, from impact to, in the case of the KPIs for the boot camps, job placement rates, income improvement by ratio of 2x, 3x, etc., gender equality, increase in salary. So I think you look at, from my perspective and my experience, at business development from a very systemic perspective beyond just making money. Or you having a big EBITDA or profit. So I think this is a very different approach than just companies that are only focusing on profit. And I think the future is really, to what's happening, a shift of more entrepreneurs and investors thinking about impact investing as the best types of businesses, because you're not just thinking about the profits, but you're thinking about social development, environmental development, the transformation of the society as a whole. So I think it's also the lens of the evolution of us as a human species and the challenges that we have that will drive entrepreneurs to be more driven by, intrinsic and also extrinsic motivation, but looking at the KPIs in a more broader way than just revenues and profits. I do think that, especially in the US, there's a huge industry in venture capital that is looking for, hockey stick type of growth companies. And lots of money have been put into developing these types of businesses that aren't necessarily thinking about ESGs or other metrics different than, revenues. And so in particular in the US, I think there's this huge boom of investors for the last decades. I don't think it's new. But at the same time, I've seen the growth of impact funds, and especially with climate, the very big growth of climate startups and funding in the past few years. And so I think this is a trend that's growing, in particular in the case of the US. But impact and entrepreneurship as a whole, I think, and the KPIs will be more and more robust as we evolve and realize that it's not just about making money, but solving challenges that have metrics that are beyond just revenues.
Wonderful. So Born asked if there's a video of this. This is on YouTube and LinkedIn. It'll be a podcast audio episode up on our site in 2 weeks. Nora from Mexico City says, thanks for the investment. Nesmira says, thanks. I want to get into digital nomad visa, but just to talk about the climate thing. So yes, climate tech, poverty, health, war are all huge challenges, and they're all intertwined because the climate crisis is going to affect all these things. But if we can't address climate change from all sectors, because the business is not the only solution, but there's so much interest now in funding and investing innovative climate advocacy startups, and there's incubators all over the world. So I scout for Enduring Planet. It's a great one. They're investing in US-based climate startups. Carbon Collective is another one. Norskin Accelerator. They get all over the world more and more funds, and in public-private partnerships, and are just really trying to find. There's no magic solution, but the right set of actors and ecosystem to help us not go beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. So a couple of questions on digital nomad visas. So first of all, you were the driving force behind launching Colombia's digital nomad visa. So can you put a little bit of a plug in, just like the nuts, before we talk about the ecosystem of digital nomads, what is it? If someone's watching this now or in the future, how do they take advantage of it? And and how does that connect to your business? Can people access it through ePioneers, World Tech Makers? What's the process? And do you have any metrics of, because Colombia will say pre-pandemic, Catalina's from Bogota, so I've been coming for 20 years, living here for 5 in Medellin. So pre-pandemic, you would know this better than me, probably Medellin's number 6 or 7 on the world of the top 10 digital hotspots for digital nomads. Pandemic, it slowed down, but it's coming back. But so just a little bit, someone's watching this, oh my gosh, I want to do this or explore it. How do they do it?
Well, first of all, now you can be a legal digital nomad because before, what foreigners or digital nomads were doing in Colombia were entering as tourists, in which case you had only the permit of staying 180 days, or as students. And so even though they were professionals and they were really here for a student program, they'll sign up for Spanish classes or something like this, but they weren't really interested in coming in this kind of way. Now, you can stay in the country for up to 2 years. You can access a state ID. You can directly rent your own place, which was not legal or possible before. You can open your bank account. You can pay you can access your health because you have a state ID. You can register a company without having the investor's visa now. With just a digital nomad visa and your state ID, you can go to the Chamber of Commerce and register a business. And so this impact, I think, will be seen in a big way in a few years. I don't think it's going to be clear yet. There are metrics on how many foreigners we receive in Colombia per year. So it's about 4.5 million. This is ProColombia data every year, creating $6.7 billion of annual revenue for the country, from which 14% is business revenue, so business tourism. So people who come not just to have recreational activities, but for business or receiving services. And with more than 35 million digital nomads now, and post-COVID remote work policies, and like you said, the growth of cities like Bogota or perhaps Medellin as hubs for digital nomads, people can realize that they can work from cities like Bogota for a year or 2 years as digital nomads. Have access to affordable living and amazing services at a fraction of a cost that they'll pay in New York or San Francisco, and then also save lots of money while boosting our local economy. And so these impact KPIs, I think, will be seen in a few years. As a startup, so the umbrella of the concierge service program that we're offering is called ePioneer under the World Tech brand. And so what I'm doing now, since this was finally activated a few months ago, is kind of building a team that will take care of the full operation here locally to be an online concierge service platform for digital nomads to develop the opportunity for both internationals and the local community. And I'll kind of transition out from this full time to focus on climate, but I have been working on building the team for that. If you go to epioneer.io, you can see what we're offering in terms of kind of like the membership packages, but there's still a lot to be done, Craig, like a lot of awareness to create. A lot of people don't know about this digital nomads visa because this wasn't a government initiative, actually. So we had to take it first to, the Congress, which was kind of the opposition at the time a few years ago. And then we had to navigate the government at the time. And now it's kind of the other way because we have to kind of educate the government about this because no political party took it as a program they envisioned, despite the potential this has. And so there's a lot to do around awareness, ecosystem building, development, partnerships, even education about what this means for everyone. But this is kind of the work for the online concierge system. And if you look at, ecosystems like the Estonian program, which was actually one of the biggest inspirations because one of my mentors from Draper University, he was working at Rocket Internet in Germany. He's American, but he was living in Berlin. And then he left because he was hired by Estonia to deploy the e-residency program a few years ago. And so he lived in Estonia for almost 4 years. And now he's a tech fellow for the US Congress. But I invited him during the pandemic to help out with the development of the vision and the proposal to the different governmental entities to launch digital nomad visa. And in Estonia, the impact of the e-residency program has been huge. So over 96,000 digital nomads or e-residents have created over 13,000 companies that in turn have generated over 1 billion euros in revenue for local, kind of like, I guess, employees and the ecosystem, and also over 40 million euros in tax revenue for Estonia. And these are just some numbers, besides, of course, the economic boost that they create, the competitiveness of attracting international talent. And so I think the KPIs and the impact will be seen maybe in 5 or 10 years. Maybe now it's too early. We're just kind of sharing about these. And I think there's a lot to see happening in Colombia on that in the next years.
So imagine that I know nothing about Colombia and you think my work is interesting. So whoever watches this now or in the future, like, what is your pitch? Not that there's one reason, but like, why would someone who has the ability to either found their company and travel or has a remote friendly job, like, why might they want to spend some time in Colombia? Like, not just as a tourist, like, do you have like a pitch or some other, we're the second most biodiverse country in the world. Medellin's the city of eternal spring. But what are your top key pitches? Why someone might want to consider Colombia?
Well, yeah, first, nature is amazing. It's a beautiful country. We've been the same day. In the same day, you can see the all thermal ecosystems of nature in less than 12 hours, actually, if you go in the car. And we also have amazing tourism opportunities. So, we have the North, the Caribbean, the Amazon in the South, the Pacific, the mountains in the center, the Llanos in the East. So it's a very biodiverse country. Now, if you're thinking in terms of a digital nomad, and if you're, for instance, in IT, you can, let's say, instead of paying 2,500 or 3,500 for a room in New York or, San Francisco, with $1,000, you can have a good life per month, because of the currency exchange rate, while also providing time to developing the ecosystem with volunteering experiences, or boosting the local economy by spending, in dollars, but then, you're saving a lot of resources. I also think in terms of the transformation of Colombia in the past years, and recognizing and acknowledging that we have a lot of challenges that are yet to be solved, and these may take decades. I have seen the development of entrepreneurship and also, conflict that has been put to an end to some extent with the peace treaty, the arrival of thousands of digital nomads in Medellin. I think there are thousands of people in cities like Medellin, and also the effort from the local ecosystem to transform and develop. And I think this is something that new generations and especially innovation has created, like new types of jobs, new types of visions around technology development or education or innovation, at the same time as we kind of conserve, hopefully, and preserve our natural resources. So these are some of the explanations I give. It's also an adventure to be in Colombia. I think you have to be here to really understand these. But it's a beautiful country, and I think people are also very beautiful in general, very kind and very friendly compared to other countries. And so this is also a plus, of course. So.
Mm-hmm. So one last quick admin question, then we'll get back into like bigger picture, and we still have 5 to 10 minutes if anybody wants to share more comments and questions. So let's say I'm living in Switzerland or New York, and I want to do this digital. Like you've convinced me, I've already thought about it, and like this is the place I want to come. Just nuts and bolts. What's the process? How long does it take? You don't have to get into finances, but like, is it a 6-month process that's drawn out forever? Like, and can you do it all digitally, or you have to go to an embassy or consulate?
Yeah, so this is a problem we're solving now. So you can have access to 2 types of membership. So one is like a 1-hour VIP expedited onboarded process where we identify the best visa type. And then the other one is the full package service, which is $90.99 to $999. This includes us going to the embassy, getting your visa stamp, us going to the office for the state ID, even if you're not here. In terms of time, the new legislation changed some other visas, actually. And so there's new information, and it's taking about 30 days to process a full application after you apply. So you may have this and take this into consideration, but you can do the process without being in the country. So we help you with that. And this is how we're kind of operating now. Now, in terms of the next steps for us, we want to deploy a platform that we are refactoring so that you can connect with verified service providers at no extra cost for the time you stay here. So whether it's a year or 2. And you can book services from them directly to guarantee, security, transparency, and access to the ecosystem digitally before even arriving. And this creates more transparency, especially if you're new to Colombia, you don't necessarily speak the language, or you don't have a community. And so this is something we're working on so that software can also optimize costs that a lot of traditional lawyers are charging for, and also bring technology to the table as a new layer to enable more transparency and that connection. So we'll hopefully deploying very soon.
So an ethical or a data question about digital nomadism. So, there still is a lot of, not talking about Colombia, I'm talking in general, there's still a lot of structural discrimination by citizenship. And so there is the saying, opportunity is, talent is universal, opportunity is not. And obviously remote work is different than digital nomad. They're not exactly the same, they could be, but remote work is increasing much more economic opportunity for lots of people who don't have to move to capitals or other regions. Digital nomad is often much harder for people who have the wrong passport. And so I'm just curious, like, from your own experience and when you talk to people, do you see like equity being a focus of the digital nomad ecosystem, or it's more people who have global north passports tend to be the ones, not even just financially, but just because they can more easily do the paperwork? Like, so is there equity in digital nomadism, where it's really mostly people from the global north going to other places?
I don't have the data to answer this question. I do have the data in terms of some mapping that has been done in nomad lists, for instance, or some studies about digital nomads. Most tend to be men working in IT, over 30 years. But there's no yet a lot of data to be accounted for. And like I was telling you, a lot of people were entering Colombia as tourists when in reality they were not. So I think there's a lot of data to kind of assess there. I do think there's discrimination by nationality, unfortunately, and also by other types of discrimination. But I think in particular with the new types of jobs, there's more flexibility. And I dream with a world that's more interconnected and where the artificial borders of nationalities are kind of put, as not the priorities versus the talent or value you can bring to an ecosystem, or the value you are as a person. But of course, this can take decades before lots of countries adopt that vision. But you're seeing it, and you see the notion of state nation, network nations, and also with new types of jobs, the capacity of people to move around and live from different countries and experience life in these ecosystems, and then go back if they want to their birth, their origin of birth. But in my kind of ideal world, there shouldn't be any visa barriers.
Yes, I mean, it's crazy that walls are being, I grew up, the Berlin Wall was there, and like when it came down, there was like this, and I moved to Central Europe 8 months after the end, like when the wall came down. So there was this vision, like, borders are going down, and now it's the walls are coming back up in a lot of places. So I have 3 more quick questions, and if anyone else wants to share something. So one is just as a professional who's hired people. So, I mean, 2 questions around hiring. So one is ePioneers or World Tech Makers hiring at all? And just when you have hired, what makes a candidate stand out for you, in terms of why you would interview him or her versus the many other applications you get? So any recommendations on hiring for the applicants?
Wow, that's a tough question. I think that's a huge challenge for me, talent identification and team building. Hopefully this will stay like this. But definitely competencies, whether you're competent or not, passionate also, and something I look for, of course, values, which a lot of times can be, and from my experience, I've made a lot of mistakes around hiring to have to acknowledge. But yeah, if you're driven by a purpose versus you're driven by something else, and in my case, I've lived both experiences. And then definitely dynamic range, especially in startups. You're looking for people who can do many different things at an early stage. So, people who can leave the challenge of, 1 in the morning doing sales and then perhaps helping with product or project management. And if you're a developer, not just focus on developing, but also having, more long-term or broad vision. So especially in early stage startups, these are some of the metrics and kind of qualities I look for. Of course, besides the values that I look for that resonate with me as a person.
So a question related to ePioneers and kind of the future. Can you describe a little bit about the intersection of blockchain, climate finance, whether it's NFTs, and there has been a lot of critiques of some of the carbon credits, even NFTs, like I forgot what country it is, but there were it was somewhere in South America, not Colombia, where they were selling carbon credit like NFTs and claiming they had local support, and then a journalist or somebody went there. So both like what your vision is, and also let's say, like, is it climate investment? Is it carbon credits? Like, what is it? And then what are some positives and some challenges you've seen to kind of the larger movement around, depending if it's carbon credits or NFTs or something else?
Yeah, so I think we need to kind of approach this in a very general perspective and then go more in the micro. So in general, carbon credits are climate finance, right? So these are markets that were developed by the UN and different countries to incentivize nature protection or restoration. what happened was that some regions developed the markets more than others. So for instance, what's called the voluntary carbon market in the US and Latin America and the rest of the world weren't regulated. This came from the European Union kind of government to regulate the reduction of carbon pollution and force companies to pay a fee for going over those limits or kind of keeping under those limits. And so these are the cap and trading markets. And there's a huge disconnect in terms of carbon pollution. So the most polluting countries are the US, China, and the European Union, actually, the region. And they have developed the most infrastructure for climate finance. So while they pollute the most, they also benefit from that pollution, justifying kind of like the, pollution. Whereas in regions like the Big South, the pollution has been way less, but the effects because of the location of the countries will be the highest, despite us having the most biodiverse ecosystems, for instance, or incredible potential for developing carbon markets. And so there's a huge disconnect between the development of these climate finance models and infrastructures that we're looking to solve, and a huge problem with the traditional methodologies for verifying whether these projects are being funded or not, were originated in continental Europe, for instance. And so for you to start a project, you have to pay $30K or euros, and then you have to wait 2 years before having your carbon credits kind of verify. If you are a small farmer in Latin America or someone who has access to land, you cannot necessarily pay the $30K, and you cannot necessarily wait 2 years. And so all these methodologies that were developed for many years from these regions were thought about, and for these regions. Now, what does blockchain has to do with this? So I think there's a huge need to understand blockchain beyond cryptocurrencies or NFTs. Blockchain is this infrastructure and architectural design that enables data transfer, data storage, and also data creation in a way that's more secure and also harder to kind of like, trick, because you have to prove the data in different blocks. And so there are different types of blockchains. But in this case, in a very general way, it's like an infrastructure built on blocks. And for you to transfer data to another, you have to prove to the other blocks that there's either consensus or a mechanism to prove that there was actually a transaction. We're working on Algorand, which is the most sustainable blockchain. It's out of MIT by actually the creator of Zero Proof Knowledge. His name is Silvio Micali. So he's actually one of the persons leading cryptography as an industry. And the cost of transactions is very low. The energy consumption is very, very low. All the transactions are final, and also it's very fast. And so Algorand is the blockchain of our choice. And what we want to do is, in a way, replace the traditional verification and monitoring process and even credit generation process with the technology itself. So enable one funder to connect with a supplier via the marketplace, fund, and then trace the investment, of course, with data of where this investment comes from, almost in real time, versus having to wait 2 years or 3 years and having to go through a consultancy firm that doesn't have technology, but it's all closed doors, which is what's happening right now. And so there's been a lot of double counting because you cannot really trace the investment. And then it takes a lot of time to get the feedback loop. And so this is one of the biggest challenges. And of course, activating the local ecosystems for environmental credits at an international standard. So forcing pricing from environmental credits at the local price to international standards. And also, of course, solving the shortage of climate portfolios that are taking place in regions like Europe or the US. So it's kind of a global effort.
Okay, amazing. So last 2 questions for someone who wants to dig in much more into climate finance, whether it's carbon offsets or something else. Do you have any recommended websites, platforms, or because where do you? There's someone just like I need to dive into this. Where do they start?
Wow. So you can go to our blog, blog.ePioneers.io, or Climate VC in the US. There's also NFX. If you do NFX climate, or A16Z, they have a magazine called Futures, and it's very high quality. I also think the European region has more development in terms of content, but you have to think about the perspective. It's more focused on Europe. And so I think there's a lot, but those will be kind of starting points. And
Yes.
also podcasts. The former president of Costa Rica, Cristina Figueres, launched a podcast on climate. So also go to Spotify and Google Climate Podcasts. I think there's a lot of content there. And communities, work, climate,
Yes.
there are a few. I can share them with you so you can share them after.
Yeah, like My Climate Journey is quite good. There's one,
Yeah.
Climate EU, Climate Based, Terra Do. There's Climate Asia.
Right.
So
Yes.
last question, what do you, I mean, it could be something you're doing completely for fun, like watching a series or reading a book, or it could be something you're upskilling, but like, what are you, when you're not trying to, we've launched the digital nomad visa, when you're not building out the infrastructure or working on climate finance, what are you working on upskilling, or is there a show that you're watching or a book you're reading that just helps your brain slow down?
Well, I'm usually reading, traveling, or what else? Doing sports.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like.
But any
Yeah,
books or
boring,
any books or shows that are just really blowing your mind, that whether it's fun or connected to your work?
Right now, I'm watching the NASA series on ecosystem services with remote sensing, and they have a program around remote sensing and the technologies satellites, bring to climate. So I'm watching these YouTube videos right now, but I'm usually reading books that I find.
Okay, very cool. I mean, there's a really interesting publicly traded B Corp called Planet, which is, it's traded on the stock. I mean, this is not making any financial advice, but they are a B corporation and they're using small satellites to do, rapid mapping of like the world for ag disasters. And, it's interesting use of the wide scale application of affordable satellites for public good and not to spy on people, because there's a lot of satellites that are being used for other things. So last thing before we finish, what kind of help are you looking for related to ePioneers or World Tech Makers? Obviously, sharing about the digital nomad visa, checking out your blog, but like, what are other things people subscribe to your channels? What are other things people can do to help?
Yeah, so I'm moving to the UK and I'm looking for partners and also, like companies to join a pilot or investors. So these will be kind of the main focus. In terms of team building, we're not hiring at the moment. You mentioned this, I forgot to answer. But yeah, always open to talent and checking out who you are if you're interested to connect. Just one email away.
Okay, thank you so much for generously sharing your time and wisdom, and for people watching from all over. And our next podcast will be March 6th with Lawal Mayan, who's originally from South Sudan and has been doing gaming for social change forever, and is a game designer, entrepreneur, and won all sorts of awards. So we'll be talking about we're staying on the tech thing, but then the following week we have two podcasts, one on big data from some at the World Economic Forum, and then we'll have two podcasts the second week of March. The other one, those will all be up, but with lots of amazing podcasts coming up in the next few months. We'll have people from UNICEF and Juanes' Foundation, Misangre, from all over the world. So just stay tuned, and thank you so much, Ilana. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you everyone for watching. And again, you can watch this on LinkedIn or YouTube, or it'll be up in a podcast format in about 2 weeks. So thank you so much. I'm hitting end.